On the morning of June 5th, 2009, LAPD Detective Dan Jaramillo was handed a case that had remained cold for over 2 decades, a homicide that, despite the passage of time, still demanded justice. The case was particularly sensitive. It had lingered in the shadows of unsolved mysteries until a breakthrough recently tested DNA evidence. Jaramillo knew exactly who to turn to for answers: Detective Stephanie Lazarus. She was a veteran of the LAPD, having served since the early 1980s, and was still very much active when the murder had occurred. Over the years, Lazarus had grown into a legend within the department. A vivacious and dedicated officer, she became a well-known figure amongst her peers. Her commitment was undeniable. She worked overtime, volunteered to speak at schools, and even found time to marry a fellow officer. But it wasn't just her hard work that set her apart. It was her infectious personality. She was adored by her colleagues, admired by her superiors, and had earned the respect of everyone who crossed her path. She wasn't just liked, she was revered. Starting as a patrol woman, Lazarus had climbed through the ranks with impressive speed, excelling in high-profile divisions like homicide, drug abuse, resistance education, and internal affairs. By 2008, she had secured a prestigious position in the art theft and fraud division, handling some of the most high-profile cases in the department. Her charisma and strong public relations skills made her an ideal fit for the role, and her reputation grew. She had even appeared on a special week-long segment of Family Feud, celebrating the stories of America's finest law enforcement officers. She was a 2-time Detective of the Year, known for her no-nonsense approach and her flawless track record. No disciplinary hearings in her entire career. So, when Jaramillo approached Lazarus for assistance on a new case, she was eager to help. He explained he had a suspect in custody, someone who could provide valuable information on an art theft, a case Lazarus was more than qualified to assist with. They made their way to the holding cells in the LAPD basement, and Lazarus, as was protocol, relinquished her weapon before entering the small interrogation room. There was an odd tension in the air when they walked in, and Lazarus couldn't help but notice something was off. The suspect chair, which was typically empty, was now vacant for another reason. The men ushered her to sit down, but as she settled into the chair, she realized this wasn't going to be a routine interrogation. Instead, it was a setup for something much more personal. Jaramillo, looking uncomfortable, informed her that the case was not about art theft. It was about something much closer to home. With a slight pause, he mentioned a name: John Rudden. Lazarus froze, confused. She had gone to college with him, and now Jaramillo was firing questions at her about him? What did she know? How well did she know him? As the interrogation wore on, Jaramillo finally revealed the truth. The case they were about to dive into involved John's wife, a murder, the investigation into Sherry Rasmussen's death, which had gone unsolved for 23 years. At that moment, Stephanie Lazarus was plunged into a nightmare she never saw coming. The story of Sherry Rasmussen was one of brilliance, beauty, and ambition. Born in 1957, Sherry was a prodigy, gifted and driven from an early age. Raised in Tucson, Arizona, Sherry had the kind of intellect that set her apart. She graduated early from elementary school, and by the time she was 16, she had earned a place at La Sierra University in California. Her journey didn't stop there. By the age of 23, Sherry had not only completed her nursing degree, but was already building an impressive career in critical care nursing. She was a force to be reckoned with in the medical world. She had the sharp mind, the work ethic, and the drive to become a leading expert in her field. As her career soared, Sherry was awarded her own condo in Van Nuys, California, a symbol of her success and independence. Despite her accomplishments, Sherry still yearned for something more, a family to share it with. And in May 1984, just as she was settling into her professional life, she met the man who would change everything. John Rudden, a charming and ambitious mechanical engineer, caught her attention at a party hosted by a mutual friend. He was tall, confident, and just as driven as Sherry. They quickly became inseparable, and within a year, John proposed. It wasn't with a traditional ring, but with a practical gift, a new car, something Sherry would truly appreciate. As their relationship blossomed, so did their life together. They married in November 1985 and honeymooned in Jamaica before returning to spend the holidays with Sherry's family. John's career was also taking off, and the couple seemed poised for a happy future. But the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life would soon shatter everything. By the end of 1986, John had settled into a new job at Macropolis, a hard drive manufacturing company. But it was clear that their story was far from over. On a cold February morning, John left for work earlier than usual, kissing his wife Sherry goodbye as she lay undecided beneath the covers. She had an HR class to supervise at the hospital that day, something she thought unnecessary, but he encouraged her to go anyway. As John stepped out the door at 7:20 a.m., he had no idea it would be the last time he would see her alive. Hours later, when he called to check on her, the phone went unanswered. He thought she was still in bed, perhaps having decided to skip work. But even after calling again, there was no response. Sherry had always turned on the answering machine before leaving, yet today it was silent. Concerns started to creep in. He called her office where Sylvia, her secretary, informed him that Sherry hadn't yet arrived. It was unusual, but not entirely unexpected, considering her class schedule. Still, John dismissed his concerns, assuming she'd gone in after all and simply forgotten to turn the machine on. The day moved on as usual. By the time John finished work and headed home, something felt off. It was nearly 6 p.m. when he pulled into their garage. The roller door stood wide open. Sherry's BMW was gone. He parked, hearing the crunch of broken glass beneath his tires. Confused, he got out and saw the shards scattered just outside the entrance. Perhaps she'd hit something while backing out, he thought. Maybe the garage door had been left open by mistake, just like that time a few weeks ago. When John walked up the stairs to the condo, something stopped him in his tracks. The door at the top of the stairs was wide open. The hair on his neck stood up as he approached. Inside, the living room looked like a war zone. Electronics were ripped from their cabinets, wires hung from shelves, and pieces of furniture lay strewn across the floor. But it wasn't the destruction that caught his attention. It was the silvery, cowering creatures who had been crawling around. There, among the shattered pieces of a ceramic vase, lay Sherry, motionless, still barefoot. Her robe had slipped off her shoulders, revealing the camisole and panties she'd been wearing when he left. His heart raced as he rushed to her side, expecting her to stir, to greet him with the warmth and comfort he was so used to. But she didn't. Her face was swollen, blood caked on her skin, and bruises painted an awful picture of violence. Her right eye was swollen shut, the lashes encrusted with blood, while her left eye stared unblinking into nothing. Her lips parted, but no breath escaped. Her skin was pale, almost ashen, and her body cold to the touch. John's mind raced. Could she have fallen, passed out? But when he felt for a pulse, the cold truth set in. There was nothing! He refused to believe it, even as the signs became undeniable. Rigor mortis had already taken hold, leaving Sherry's body frozen in a grotesque position, one leg raised, her arm reaching as though she had tried to fight for help. He could no longer deny it. His wife, the woman he had been married to for just 3 months, was gone. In shock, John called 911. his voice trembling as he muttered the words, "I think my wife is dead." When the paramedics arrived, they confirmed what John feared. Sherry had been brutally murdered. Her body was battered and lifeless. The LAPD arrived shortly thereafter, and Detective Lyle Mayer took charge of the scene. As Mayer surveyed the living room, the evidence told a disturbing story. A violent struggle had taken place. Sherry, tall and fit, had fought back fiercely. 2 of her fingernails were torn off, but she was no match for the gun that had taken her life. The damage to her face was so severe that the paramedics missed the 3 bullet wounds in her chest. One of the bullets had passed through her body, while the other 2 remained lodged in her torso. Recovered later during the autopsy, a quilted blanket on the couch caught Mayer's eye. 2 small bullet holes with powder burns marked its surface. Further inspection revealed that the bullets in Sherry's chest had been fired at close range, suggesting the killer had pressed the gun to her body and fired 2 more rounds after a first, more distant shot. It was clear that the murder was deliberate, personal. The bite mark on Sherry's arm reinforced that chilling fact. Forensic investigators collected evidence throughout the condo. Sherry's torn fingernails, bloodied rope, and samples from the bite mark. They checked for signs of sexual assault, but there were none. They also found no signs of forced entry into the condo, which only deepened the mystery. The police quickly settled on the theory that Sherry had surprised a burglar, who had then attacked and killed her. Her electronics were scattered about, and the apparent motive seemed to be robbery. Yet there was a major inconsistency. The only thing missing was Sherry and John's marriage certificate. The thief had left behind valuable electronics, yet had gone through the trouble of disconnecting them, only to make off with a paper that seemed insignificant in comparison. The theory was flimsy at best, but it was the one the detectives pursued. The case was marked as a burglary gone wrong. They questioned John, who was cleared of any involvement, but his doubts lingered. Weeks passed without progress. Neighbors, friends, and family were questioned, but no new leads emerged. Sherry's BMW was found, abandoned and unlocked, miles from the condo. Inside, forensic teams found fingerprints, blood, and a single strand of brown hair. But with limited DNA testing capabilities at the time, it didn't bring them any closer to finding her killer. The case seemed to stall until a similar burglary occurred 2 months later. 2 men had broken into a neighboring condo, assaulting a woman in the process. Detective Mayer jumped on the opportunity, believing this was the break he needed to link the 2 crimes. The case was officially closed, with the theory that the same burglars had killed Sherry during a botched robbery. But Sherry's family, particularly her father Nels Rasmussen, wasn't convinced. He had a nagging suspicion that they were missing something important. Nels knew something the police didn't. Sherry had confided in him about a troubling encounter with John's ex-girlfriend, a woman who had made it clear she wouldn't let go of John so easily. In the months leading up to Sherry's death, she had mentioned this woman more than once. John's ex had confronted Sherry at work, making thinly veiled threats. She'd told Sherry that if she couldn't have John, no one could, and sneered that she'd be waiting when their marriage failed. The encounter had rattled Sherry deeply, but John had brushed it off, assuring her there was nothing to worry about. John's explanation about his old college doormate was straightforward. Nothing more than a former friend with benefits, no romantic history, yet the reality was far darker. Sherry, his wife, had no reason to doubt him at first, but an unsettling tension hung in the air. After their honeymoon, this woman appeared at their condo, uninvited, and unapologetically. She claimed she needed John to wax her water skis, an odd, clearly fabricated excuse. What troubled Sherry more, however, was how the woman had gained access to their gated complex without so much as a phone call. Sherry, uneasy, confronted John, but he downplayed it, insisting that refusing her would only escalate the situation. This marked the beginning of Sherry's growing concern about the woman's unrelenting presence in their lives. On the woman's next visit, Sherry's frustration boiled over and she demanded her to leave. But the woman, relentless, brushed her off. Sherry felt increasingly isolated, particularly as John's inability to stand firm against this woman, despite his reassurances, left her feeling like she had to handle it herself. By January 1986, a month before Sherry's brutal murder, the woman's audacity reached new heights. She appeared at the couple's home, uninvited once again, this time at 10 a.m. on a weekday. John was at work, and Sherry, running late for her shift at the hospital, was caught off guard. As she hurried to get ready, a chilling noise came from downstairs. To her horror, the woman was standing in their living room, dressed in an LAPD uniform, a gun strapped to her waist. When Sherry demanded an explanation, the woman ignored her, simply stating she was there to see John. Fear and disbelief washed over Sherry, and she immediately called police. Nels urged her to report the woman to the police, but given the woman's position as a fellow officer, Sherry was hesitant. Her decision to handle the situation privately would prove tragic. The woman's intrusion would mark the final, fatal chapter in Sherry's life. Weeks later, after Sherry's murder, Nels relayed his suspicions about the woman to Detective Mayer. Yet Mayer dismissed them with an offhand comment about watching too many cop shows, showing no interest in investigating further. Even though Nels had been in contact with his daughter's killer, the detective chose to ignore him. He did, however, take note of the woman's name after speaking to John, confirming she was an ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, a fellow officer. Despite this, Lazarus was not interviewed, and her involvement was never pursued. The case file, astonishingly, showed signs of deliberate concealment. Crucial records, including the investigators' notes on the first 3 months of the investigation, were missing. Meanwhile, every other interview was meticulously documented, except those involving Lazarus. The blue wall of silence had descended, and it would shield her from scrutiny for years. As the investigation faltered, Sherry's case was buried, left to grow cold. The Rasmussens, desperate for answers, called the LAPD repeatedly, but were met with indifference. When they took the case to the press, even offering a $10,000 reward, the leads remained dry. Hope seemed all but lost, until Nels read about the potential of DNA testing to solve cold cases. Despite Mayer's refusal, Nels pushed for a test on the blood, saliva, and hair samples collected back in 1986. Mayer, indifferent as ever, maintained that without a suspect, the tests would be pointless. Nels persisted, even offering to fund the testing himself, but Mayer shut him down once more. Years passed, and John, relieved by Mayer's assurances that Lazarus had no involvement, moved on with his life. He remarried, had children, and kept the past buried. Christopher Francis, a criminalist with the LAPD's cold case homicide unit, stumbled upon Sherry's case. Nothing had been found in her city. Cold case homicide. Counseled by the same court as himself, that was until 2003, when Jennifer Francis, a criminalist with the LAPD, she was combing through old files when she discovered that a key piece of evidence, a saliva sample taken from a bite mark on Sherry's arm, had been misfiled for 18 years. After hours of searching, she found the sample and sent it for testing. The results came back in January 2005. They didn't match any known profiles, but the DNA sequence revealed something crucial. The biter had been a woman. This revelation was at odds with the theory Mayer had championed, that 2 Latino burglars had killed Sherry during a botched robbery. Frances immediately flagged the discrepancy, but the response from her colleagues was dismissive. Despite her findings, the case went cold once more, filed away as just another unsolved mystery. Then, in 2009, Detective Jim Nuttall was assigned Sherry's case. Like Frances, Nuttall was disturbed by the glaring inconsistency between the DNA evidence and Mayer's original theory. With permission to reopen the investigation, Nuttall and his colleagues Mark Martinez and Pete Barba dove into the case. It didn't take long for them to see what Meyer had missed. Sherry had not been caught by surprise in her living room. She had been shot at while upstairs, and the killer had missed shattering the glass sliding door. She had fled downstairs in a panic, only to be cornered and viciously attacked. Meyer had been right about one thing. The nurse put up one hell of a fight. She managed to get her assailant in a headlock before they bit her arm and broke free. The killer then struck her with a ceramic vase, knocking her to the floor before shooting her once. Her life taken in a brutal, calculated act. But the killer didn't stop there. They grabbed a quilted blanket, pressed it to Sherry's chest, and fired 2 more shots. The scene wasn't a botched burglary as initially suspected. It was an execution, and it was carefully staged to throw off the police. The question remained, who in Sherry's life could orchestrate such a cold-blooded crime? Detective Nuttall and his team revisited the case file and found a chilling clue. A single note detailing a call from John Rutten, Sherry's husband, who had revealed his former girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, was a police officer. Upon investigating Lazarus, they uncovered a troubling web. She wasn't just any officer. She was a decorated detective with 25 years of service in the LAPD's art theft division, with a career so pristine it bordered on untouchable. Lazarus also worked just down the hall from Nuttall's team. Her reputation solid, her connections deep. It was a disorienting realization. Could a woman so embedded within the system really be capable of such a heinous act? The investigation into her movements that day revealed she was off-duty with no alibi, suspicious but not conclusive. But the true breakthrough came when they began probing into her firearms. Lazarus was known to carry a backup weapon, a Daughter .38 caliber Smith & Wesson. Tracing its serial number, the detectives discovered that just days after Sherry's murder, Lazarus had reported her backup gun stolen. This was more than a coincidence. It was a calculated cover-up. Yet it was still just a suspicion, and they needed more than circumstantial evidence to bring her down. By 2009, after years of dead ends, the case had gathered a weight of evidence, and the team approached Deputy Chief Michael Moore with their findings. Moore was taken aback, but he deployed a special operations team from Internal Affairs, where Lazarus had once served, to assist with the investigation. The strategy was to obtain Lazarus's DNA without alerting her. For days, undercover officers tailed her, and on May 28th, they finally got the break they needed when Lazarus disposed of a soda cup and straw at a Costco. The items were retrieved, and after decades of waiting, a DNA test confirmed the unthinkable. Stephanie Lazarus had murdered Sherry Rasmussen. With the evidence now undeniable, the detectives proceeded. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes, especially considering they were now facing one of their own. The decision was made to arrest Lazarus away from her office, a calculated move to ensure she would be unarmed and to avoid any public spectacle. But even as the detectives carefully maneuvered, they knew they had to approach her cautiously. Her involvement was shocking, and they needed her to slip. Just one mistake would be enough to seal her fate. As they interrogated her, Lazarus remained calm at first, deflecting with vague responses. But when the detectives pressed her on Sherry's murder, her composure cracked, the mask slipped, and she grew defensive, finally demanding a lawyer, her anger bubbling to the surface. She stood abruptly, clearly convinced she was untouchable, but she had underestimated the detectives, who stood ready. As Lazarus moved toward the door, Handcuffs awaited her. On June 5, 2009, she was arrested, and the weight of justice began to settle in. In the days that followed, the detectives worked tirelessly to uncover the motive that had driven Lazarus to murder. It quickly became apparent that her obsession with John Rutten, Sherry's husband, had festered into something far darker. Their history went back to college, where Lazarus had developed an unrequited love for John. She became entwined in his life, despite his indifference, even as he moved on and became engaged to Sherry. Lazarus's feelings spiraled into obsession. When John announced his engagement, it shattered her. The final blow came when, after a brief affair, John made it clear that he would never choose her. In a rage, Stephanie decided that if she couldn't have him, no one could. Sherry was in her way, and she would eliminate the obstacle once and for all. After her arrest, Lazarus maintained her innocence, but the case against her was overwhelming. In 2012, the trial revealed the disturbing extent of Lazarus's obsession and the meticulousness of her crime. The jury deliberated for only 24 hours before convicting her of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life, but the story didn't end there. Lazarus appealed her conviction, but her plea was rejected. Meanwhile, the Rasmussens sought justice through a lawsuit against both Lazarus and the LAPD for their role in the cover-up. However, the law would protect the institution that had failed to hold one of their own accountable. Stephanie Lazarus remains behind bars, but the shadow of her crime looms over the justice system, untouchable, just as the police department that once shielded her still remains.